The oak staircase was cold as ice when Elara's body tumbled down. Her hands clawed at the air, struck the banister, then slammed against the landing, and by instinct, before the pain even had time to arrive, both arms locked tight around her 6-month pregnant belly. The baby. Please don't. Not again. Know your place, you useless little tramp. Collin Ashworth stood at the top of the stairs, his face flat and bloodless, calmly adjusting the sleeve of his dark blue suit as if he'd just brushed away a speck of dust rather than shoved a pregnant woman to the ground. Behind him, the hollow luxury of the Ashworth mansion lay still in the January cold of Chicago. Tall walls, expensive paintings, and the thick, suffocating silence of a house that had never known what warmth truly was. Outside the window, snow fell soundlessly over the North Shore suburbs, whitening the driveway as if trying to bury something ugly underneath. Elara's shoulder throbbed. The gray maid's uniform tore open at the seam, exposing a patch of skin already blooming red and purple. But what burned in her chest wasn't pain. It was fear, pure and undiluted, the kind only mothers understand. Her hands tightened around her belly as though her body itself could become the last wall between her child and the world. Whose kid is that? Huh? Elara? Collin's voice drifted down from above, slick with the cheap arrogance of a man who's never had to earn a single thing he owns. You think some sentimental story about a so-called secret husband is going to stop me from selling this house? You're just a maid, Elara. Nothing more. A shadow in a house that doesn't belong to you. Never did. He smirked. Knock yourself up and try to cling to a dead man's property. You really think anyone's buying that? His words cut deeper than the fall, deeper than the bruise spreading across her shoulder. They sliced into the place Elara had tried to bury for 13 years. The place where a 14-year-old girl in McDowell County, West Virginia, first learned that the world could look straight at her face and decide she didn't exist. She survived the foster care system. She survived Mrs. Prentiss's hand clamped too tight around her wrist, and the whispered hiss of, "You ought to be grateful someone even took you in." She ran at 17 on a Greyhound bus with $40 in her pocket, heading to Chicago alone, scrubbing floors and polishing glass in mansions where she was never allowed to sit down. She survived all of that, only to be hunted by a man who mistook her silence for weakness. But Collin Ashworth didn't understand what Elara Whitfield's silence meant. She remembered that night, 1 year ago. January rain lashed across the Michigan Avenue Bridge, so cold it struck her skin like needles. She stood there, not because she'd decided anything, but because her feet had simply stopped moving forward. Below, the Chicago River reflected the city lights like shattered diamonds, beautiful and indifferent. Her mother's voice, Mama Jo, drifted back from a kitchen in West Virginia, from another lifetime. You were born to be more than this, baby girl. Elara had almost laughed at the cruelty of memory. Then came the sound of a car. A black Escalade pulled up, not slowly like a predator, but precise and deliberate, the way someone stops when they've seen exactly what they needed to see. The window lowered. Jude Moretti's dark, obsidian eyes looked at her from inside, and she knew at once, with the instinct of someone who's been seen through her whole life, that this man wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her, seeing her, not with pity, with recognition, the kind of recognition that comes from someone who's stood at the edge before and knows exactly what that moment looks like, as if he'd seen this scene once before. And this time, he wasn't too late. That man gave her his name, his protection, and his heart. Jude Moretti, the name Chicago whispers with reverence, the name that stills boardrooms and makes powerful men stare at their shoes, knelt before her in a wedding no one was allowed to remember, slid a platinum ring onto her finger, and swore in a language that didn't need words that the world would burn before it ever touched her again. And Collin Ashworth, standing at the top of the stairs with his victorious smile, didn't know any of it. Elara swallowed the pain and forced herself upright, one arm cradling her belly, her eyes lifting to meet the staircase. At that exact moment, from below, the mansion's front door began to open, not loudly, not dramatically, just the slow turn of hinges and a rush of January air spilling into the foyer like a warning. Elara's voice came out hoarse, but each word was clear, heavy, laid into the silence like a blade carving stone. "I'm not trespassing. I'm the reason you're still breathing today." She paused. Light from outside flooded through the doorway, washing across the marble floor, stretching toward the foot of the stairs like the shadow of something arriving that can't be stopped. "But I think your time just ran out." If this story stirred something in you, if you want to know what happens when that door opens all the way, press like so this story can reach those who need to hear it. Share this video with a friend who needs to remember that silence doesn't mean weakness. And subscribe to the channel, because the next story is coming, and it'll find you right when you need it. 12 months before that staircase, Elara Whitfield sat on the leather seat of the black Escalade and felt each drop of rain fall from her hair onto the upholstery with the steady rhythm of a ticking clock counting down. She was drenched. Her whole body trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper than cold, something like her body finally allowing itself to react to everything it had endured over 27 years. The scent of leather wrapped around her, mingling with rainwater and the faint trace of sandalwood drifting from the man behind the wheel. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where they were going. And the strangest thing, in a night filled with strange things, was that she didn't ask. Jude Moretti drove through Chicago in the rain without speaking a single word. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, why she'd been standing on the bridge, or whether she wanted to die. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't make a phone call, didn't glance at her with pity or curiosity. He simply drove, both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead as if the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment was getting her to wherever she needed to be, even though neither of them yet knew where that was. The silence filled the cabin like something with weight, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence Elara had known all her life. The breath-held silence in Mrs. Prentiss's house when the woman was drunk, and Elara had to guess whether the bedroom door would open with soft footsteps or a shout. It wasn't the silence of the welfare office waiting room, where people looked through her as though she were glass. It wasn't the silence of nights curled inside a sleeping bag in the storage shed behind a laundromat in Humboldt Park, listening to rats scurry and telling herself tomorrow would be better while knowing it wouldn't. The silence in this car was different. It didn't demand anything from her. It didn't ask her to explain. Didn't ask her to be grateful. Didn't ask her to shrink herself to fit inside a space smaller than her true size. For the first time in her life, another person's silence didn't make Elara afraid. She looked out the window. Chicago drifted by like a city underwater. Streetlights smeared by rain. Skyscrapers reduced to vertical streaks of light. She saw the sign of a restaurant where she'd mopped floors 3 years earlier. The owner paying her $4 an hour and calling it a favor. She saw the intersection where she'd waited for the bus at 5 o'clock on winter mornings. Bare hands without gloves. Breath turning to smoke. She saw the city that hadn't seen her for 10 years, and she wondered whether the man beside her saw the same city or something entirely different. The car turned onto a road she'd never traveled. Then another. Then through iron gates that opened without a sound, as though they'd been expecting the vehicle. The stone driveway stretched between 2 rows of winter-stripped trees, black branches reaching into the night sky like grasping hands. And then the mansion came into view. Elara didn't know what to call it. Not a home. Home was a one-room apartment with a leaking faucet in Logan Square. Home was the kitchen floor in a trailer in McDowell County, where Mama Jo knelt, scrubbing every Saturday morning. The building before her belonged to another world, a world she'd only ever seen from the other side of a door while wiping glass and vacuuming carpets. Gray stone, tall windows, warm yellow light glowing through heavy curtains. 2 men stood on either side of the main entrance, not in uniform, but with the posture of men paid to stand exactly where they stood. They looked at the car, looked at Jude, then looked at Elara through the glass, and she knew at once, with the instinct of someone who'd survived by reading the body language of those more powerful than herself, that the man who'd just saved her wasn't a businessman, not a doctor, not a lawyer or a restaurateur or anything she could place into a familiar box. He was something she didn't have a name for, and that something was dangerous. The engine went still. Jude turned off the ignition, and in the moment before he opened the door, he turned to look at her for the first time since she'd climbed into the car. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, as if giving her time to decide, as if saying, in a language that didn't require sound, "You can stay, or you can walk away, and I won't stop you." Elara looked at the building, looked at the 2 men guarding the gate, looked back into the dark eyes of the man beside her in the scent of leather and rain. She thought, this isn't a place meant for someone like me. But her legs opened the car door and stepped out into the January cold, into the golden light, into the life she didn't yet know was waiting for her on the other side of that threshold. 2 months. 2 months Elara Whitfield lived inside the Moretti mansion, and every morning she woke expecting the price to reveal itself, because her entire life had taught her one lesson and one lesson only. Nobody gives anyone anything for free. Every roof comes with conditions. Every meal carries a bill. Every door that opens means another door closes behind you. But Jude Moretti asked for nothing. Not a single thing. He arranged a private room for her in the east wing of the mansion. A room larger than every place she had ever lived combined, with white sheets heavy as an embrace, and windows overlooking a winter garden stripped bare of leaves. He summoned a doctor to examine her in the first week, a woman named Marin Holt, small, serious, asking no unnecessary questions, simply checking Elara's health with the precision of someone who understood that in this house, care wasn't a suggestion but an order. He replaced every document she had lost, her driver's license, her social security card, everything the cleaning company had swallowed, along with 2 months of unpaid wages, through channels Elara didn't ask about, and Jude didn't explain. The papers appeared in an envelope on her bedroom table one morning, neat, complete, as if they had formed themselves out of air. She held the new license in her hand, looked at her name printed there, and felt something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it, the sensation of officially existing inside a system that had once erased her without hesitation. She observed Jude from a distance, the only way she knew how to understand a person. She had survived her entire life by observing, by reading a room before entering it, reading tone before hearing words, reading hands before they touched her. And Jude Moretti was the most difficult book she had ever tried to read. In the mornings, he sat at the head of the long dining table, studying something on his phone with the expression of a man calculating someone's fate. And when she entered, he rose, pulled out her chair, and set a plate of breakfast before her with a hand so gentle it seemed afraid to wake something fragile. In the afternoons, she heard him on the phone in his study, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to create pressure, because the pressure already lived inside each syllable, and whoever stood on the other end fell silent in the way. People only fall silent when they understand the man speaking can turn words into consequences. Then he would step out, see her reading by the window, and his eyes would change, not soften. Jude Moretti didn't soften the way ordinary men soften, but something more subtle, as if he set down an invisible weapon before stepping into any space that held her. She was confused enough that it almost made her angry, because 27-year-old Elara Whitfield had learned that the world runs on exchange, and she couldn't tell what she was giving in return. She had never met someone dangerous who was also gentle, never met someone powerful who used that power to pull out her chair instead of pulling her closer. Unconditional kindness was something she had no map for, and having no map made her panic, because she had survived by always knowing where the exits were. She tried to leave for the first time in the 3rd week. 4 a.m, she packed the few belongings she owned into the same bag she had carried the night she climbed into his car. So light it was proof she owned almost nothing in this world. She opened her bedroom door, stepped into the dark hallway, and Jude was there. Not standing guard, not standing in wait. He was walking past, or perhaps he had been walking past, or perhaps he knew, by instinct born of reading every room before entering it, that she would run. He looked at the bag in her hand, looked at her face, and asked, in the same tone one might use to ask if she wanted coffee, "Where are you going?" He didn't block her, didn't reach for her, didn't move closer. He simply stood there in the dim hallway and asked. 3 words. Elara opened her mouth and realized she had no answer, not because she didn't want to leave, but because for the first time in her life, when someone asked where she was going, she couldn't think of a single place in the world where she belonged more than where she was standing. She tried again 3 weeks later. The result was the same bag, the same hallway, the same question, the same silence where an answer should have been. The second time, when she returned to her room, she set the bag on the floor and didn't pick it up again, not because she had decided to stay, but because she had run out of places to flee to, and the place she stood, for once, wasn't something she needed to escape. 3 months. 3 months without anyone touching her without permission, without anyone raising their voice, without anyone looking at her as if she were a problem to solve, a burden to tolerate, or a body to use. 3 months of Jude Moretti treating her presence in his house as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and that ordinariness, that quiet and undramatic normalcy, was the cruelest thing he could have done to her, because it made her begin to grow accustomed to it. And Elara knew, from the hard education of survival, that growing accustomed to safety is the most dangerous thing someone like her can do. It happened one evening near the end of the second month, when Elara had grown familiar enough with the rhythm of the house to know who moved where and when, whose footsteps fell heavy and whose were light, who knocked before entering and who never did. She was in the kitchen, not because anyone had asked her to be, but because the kitchen was the only place in the mansion where her hands felt useful. She had spent her entire life working with her hands, scrubbing floors, polishing glass, washing sheets, and 3 months of sitting still in a luxurious bedroom had nearly driven her mad with the feeling of uselessness. So she cooked. No one told her to cook. No one forbade her from cooking. She simply began appearing in the kitchen in the evenings, quietly preparing the dishes Mama Jo had once taught her in the trailer in McDowell County, and leaving them on the stove for anyone who wished to eat. That night she was slicing onions, the knife moving in steady rhythm against the cutting board with the ease of someone who had held a blade since she was tall enough to reach a countertop. When the kitchen door opened, Boone stepped inside. Elara knew Boone, not because he had introduced himself. He hadn't spoken a single word to her in 2 months. But she knew him the way she knew everyone in this house, by observation. Boone was the lieutenant, one of the men Jude trusted enough to grant free passage through the mansion. A man with hands broad as shovels and a voice like gravel tumbling inside a metal drum. That night Boone was drunk. She smelled him before she saw him. Cheap whiskey tangled with stale tobacco. And when she lifted her gaze, he was leaning against the doorframe with a look she had seen on too many men's faces in her lifetime. The look of someone who has decided her presence in a room requires interrogation. "Where'd the boss pick you up from?" Boone's voice spread across the kitchen like oil slicking over water. He laughed. The kind of laugh belonging to a man just sober enough to remain dangerous and just drunk enough to lose his manners. "Must be real talented to land that room, huh? Or does the boss collect damaged goods?" Elara didn't tremble. That was the first thing. The most important thing. The thing you wouldn't understand if you didn't understand Elara Whitfield. She didn't tremble. 13 years earlier, in Mrs. Prentiss's house, she had trembled. Trembled at footsteps. Trembled at doors opening. Trembled when voices rose. That 14-year-old girl had trembled because she didn't yet know she had the option not to. But 27-year-old Elara, the one who had slept in storage sheds and eaten from trash bins and walked Chicago streets at 2 a.m. with nothing but her fists and instinct, that Elara had burned through fear a long time ago, and what remained on the other side wasn't bravery, but the simple truth that she had nothing left to lose. She set the knife down on the counter, slowly, deliberately, not because she was afraid to use it, but because she wanted Boone to see she set it down by choice, not submission. She looked directly into his eyes, and her voice came out flat and cold, and without the slightest tremor, a voice she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. "I've survived men scarier than you before breakfast. Leave this kitchen before I decide you're not worth cleaning up after." Silence followed. The heavy kind. The kind where the density of air in a room seems to shift. Boone looked at her, looked at the knife resting on the counter, looked back into her eyes, and in those gray-blue depths he didn't find what he'd come searching for. He didn't find fear. He didn't find retreat. He didn't find anything he could grip to continue his cheap little power game. He stepped back, said nothing more. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway and disappeared, and the kitchen returned to the ticking clock and the sharp scent of freshly cut onion. Elara stood there for several seconds longer, her hand still resting on the counter beside the knife, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit, and she realized her hands still hadn't shaken. Then she felt it, not a sound, not movement, presence, the kind of presence she had learned to recognize over 3 months in this house, weighty and still and unmistakable. She turned toward the kitchen doorway. Jude stood there. How long he had been standing there, she didn't know. Long enough to hear everything, and he didn't step inside. That was what made her understand. Not because he didn't want to. She saw it in the tightening line of his jaw, in the way his right hand clenched and released, in the familiar darkness behind his eyes that she had begun to learn how to read. Jude Moretti had wanted to walk into that kitchen and turn Boone into a lesson for everyone under this roof. But he didn't. Because he had seen her holding the knife, seen her set it down, seen her look straight into the eyes of a man twice her size and make him retreat with nothing but her voice and the truth. And in that moment he understood what he had sensed the night on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Elara Whitfield wasn't someone who needed saving. She was someone he wanted to stand beside. Their eyes met across the kitchen threshold. 1 second. No words. But in that second, in the 3 steps of distance between the counter and the doorway, in the scent of onions and the faint memory of rain lingering somewhere in the bones of the house, everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way dawn changes a dark room, not all at once, but so thoroughly that by the time you notice, the darkness already belongs to the past. 1 week after the night in the kitchen, on a rare Tuesday afternoon, when March in Chicago decided to pause winter and let sunlight fall across the city like a brief apology, Elara sat reading in the back garden of the Moretti mansion. The winter garden had begun to stir back to life, tiny green shoots pushing up through the cold soil with a stubbornness she found strangely familiar, and the late afternoon light slanted through the wrought iron fence, scattering gold across the stone where she sat. She was reading a book taken from Jude's study, without asking permission, because he had never told her she needed permission for anything in this house, and that small freedom, the freedom to reach for a book without seeking approval, was still something she was learning not to feel guilty for accepting. She didn't hear Jude's footsteps. She never heard his footsteps. He moved with the silence of a man who had learned that noise is a luxury truly dangerous men don't require. She only realized he was there when the chair across from her slid back, and when she looked up, Jude Moretti was seated before her, his gray suit uncreased though the day was nearly done, his hands resting on the stone table, the black ring on his ring finger catching the afternoon sun. He studied her for a moment without speaking, and Elara had lived in this house long enough to know that when Jude was silent before he spoke, what followed wasn't small. Then he opened his mouth, and with precisely the voice she had heard through the study door when he issued commands over the phone, that calm, exact voice without a wasted syllable, the voice he used to move markets and quiet entire rooms, he said, "I want you to stay, permanently, as my wife." Elara didn't answer immediately. The book remained open on her lap, her finger holding the page she had been reading, and she realized she was gripping the paper like an anchor, as though letting go would send her drifting somewhere beyond her control. She had waited 3 months to understand what Jude Moretti wanted from her, and now that he had spoken it in the clearest language possible, she realized the answer itself didn't surprise her. What surprised her was the question that left her mouth before she had time to think, the first true question she had asked him in 3 months. Not a polite question, or a practical one, but a real question, the kind she had put away long ago because no one had ever given her an answer worth hearing. Why me? 3 words, simple to the point of innocence, but inside them lived 27 years of a woman asking why the world never saw her, and now that someone said he did, she needed to know what he saw. Jude was silent, not the courteous silence of someone arranging thoughts, the silence of a man deciding which of many locked doors inside himself he was willing to open. Then he spoke, slower than usual, as if each word were being placed down by hand instead of thrown away. "Because that night in the kitchen, you picked up the knife before you looked for the exit. That's not someone who needs saving. That's someone who deserves a choice." Elara looked at him, truly looked, not with the distant, observational gaze she had used for 3 months, but with the gaze of someone allowing herself to be seen by the one who was seeing her. And she saw him, this man, Jude Moretti, dangerous enough that people whispered his name the way they whisper the name of a storm, controlled enough to manage every expression on his face the way he managed every piece on a chessboard, and gentle, inexplicably gentle. Gentle in the way only those who have been deeply wounded know how to be, because they understand the exact cost of cruelty. And she felt something she hadn't felt since Mama Jo was alive. Since the last morning her mother had been strong enough to sit up in bed and say, "You're going to be great, baby girl," in that hoarse voice Elara heard in her dreams 13 years later. She felt seen, not looked at. Seen. The difference between those 2 things was her entire life. They married 6 days later. A private ceremony in the mansion study, only Jude's most trusted lieutenant as witness, and a court official who forgot the event the moment he stepped outside the door. Because in Jude Moretti's world, the most important things are the ones the fewest people know about. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, or white dress, or any of the things other girls dream about for their wedding day. Only Jude standing before her, holding her hand, sliding a simple platinum band onto her ring finger, a ring she would later learn he had kept in his desk drawer for 2 weeks, which meant he had known, before the night in the kitchen, before she ever lifted the knife, perhaps even from the night on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, that she was the one he would choose. The ring was cool against her skin. Elara looked at it, looked at Jude's large hand wrapped around hers, and for the first time in 13 years, since Mama Jo had breathed her last in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic in McDowell County, Elara Whitfield exhaled completely. Not a sigh, not a sharp breath, but a full exhale. The breath she had held in her chest for 13 years, because she had never been safe enough to release it. She didn't yet know that love would come later, slowly, the way dawn fills a dark room, not all at once, but so thoroughly that eventually you can't remember what the darkness looked like. She only knew that standing in the study with the cool metal on her finger and his hand holding hers, she had stopped running. 9 months after the platinum ring, 9 months after the first full breath Elara allowed herself to release, the doors of the Ashworth mansion opened, and everything snapped back to the present, with the weight of a verdict already written. The doors didn't burst wide. That was the first thing Collin Ashworth would never understand until it was too late, that Jude Moretti doesn't require noise. The heavy oak door turned on its hinges with the precision of something arranged, calculated, decided long before it ever happened, and the cold January air spilled into the foyer, like the first breath of a storm, not yet willing to speak its name. 2 men entered first, not bodyguards in the way movies teach people to imagine, not slabs of muscle in black suits wearing sunglasses indoors, but quiet professionals, the kind of men you wouldn't remember if you passed them on the street, but would never forget the feeling when they step into a room with you. Their eyes scanned the space with the efficiency of men long reconciled with difficult decisions, assessing angles, exits, the position of every person present, in silence, in seconds, with the accuracy of military software. They took their places on either side of the door without instruction, without signal, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish reading. Then Jude crossed the threshold. Collin Ashworth stood at the top of the staircase and felt it before he understood it. A shift in the atmosphere so complete it was almost tangible, like the change in pressure before a storm rolls in from Lake Michigan, when the clouds haven't darkened yet but your skin already knows, your bones already know, and the most primitive part of your brain, the part that existed before language, is screaming that something is coming and you should run. The arrogance in Collin's chest, that cheap arrogance that had allowed him to stand at the top of the stairs and look down at a pregnant woman as if she were trash to be swept away, that arrogance began to loosen, quietly, without permission, like buttons popping one by one when a suit suddenly grows too tight. He felt it slipping from his chest, and didn't understand why, because he didn't yet know who the man stepping inside was. He only knew, by instinct, by something deeper than reason, that the room no longer belonged to him. Jude Moretti walked across the Ashworth foyer in a charcoal gray suit without a single crease, January's cold clinging to his shoulders like frost, the black platinum ring on his left hand, catching the light of the crystal chandelier as his fingers released the door behind him. He didn't hurry. He didn't move slowly. He moved with the rhythm of inevitability, with the exact velocity of something that can't be stopped and doesn't need to be stopped, because it was already the outcome before it became the action. And he didn't look at Collin. Not once. Not because he didn't know Collin was there. Not because he chose to ignore him as some tactic of intimidation. But because in that moment, with Elara lying on the staircase landing, one arm wrapped around her 6-month belly, one hand gripping her bruised shoulder, her maid's uniform torn at the seam, Collin Ashworth simply didn't exist. He didn't exist because the entirety of Jude Moretti's focus, every molecule of the terrifying control he had built over 15 years at the head of his family, every nerve, every heartbeat, every line of sight, moved straight, without deviation, without pause, toward the woman on the floor. Elara watched him cross the foyer. She looked up at him from the cold marble, brown hair loose across the stone, and she saw something she had never seen on her husband's face before, not anger. Anger is loud and careless. This was colder and more permanent, a man quietly rearranging his priorities in real time, storing certain information into a mental drawer labeled "will address later," with the same precision a surgeon uses to set aside one instrument before reaching for another. His footsteps echoed across the marble, steady, neither faster nor slower, each step a sentence in a judgment being delivered in silence instead of words. Collin opened his mouth, perhaps to question, perhaps to challenge, perhaps simply because he didn't yet understand that in certain rooms, opening your mouth is the last mistake you're permitted to make. But before any sound could emerge, Jude had reached the foot of the staircase, his eyes still fixed only on Elara, only on her. And the way he bypassed Collin wasn't deliberate contempt. It was something far worse. It was the complete absence of acknowledgement, as if Collin were furniture, air, nothing at all. And in that moment, standing at the top of the stairs where only minutes earlier he had felt like a king, Collin Ashworth understood for the first time in his life what it feels like to be invisible. Jude knelt down, directly on the cold marble floor, in the flawless charcoal gray suit he had put on early that morning for a meeting on the north side of the city, a meeting he had left midway when a message from the Ashworth Mansion security system flashed across his phone. 2 words, 1 address, and his world narrowed to a single point. He knelt without hesitation, without glancing down to see if the floor was dirty, without thinking about his knees, without thinking about anything except the woman in front of him, and his large hands came up to cradle her face with absolute gentleness, the kind of gentleness that, if you didn't know who he was, you'd think was the most ordinary thing in the world. But if you did know, if you knew what those hands had done and could do and would do before this night was over, that gentleness became almost violent in its contrast to everything else he was. He lifted her face. His fingers brushed over her cheek, over the dust from the marble, over the strand of brown hair caught at the corner of her mouth, with the care of a man cataloging evidence, storing every detail somewhere deep inside, where it would later be retrieved with significant interest. Elara, he said her name. Only her name, not a question. Not "are you hurt?" or "what happened?" or any of the sentences an ordinary husband might ask. Just her name, 2 syllables, spoken in the same low, steady voice she had heard 100 times over the past 9 months, but never like this. It was inventory. It was confirmation. It was the way he said, "I'm here, and I've seen, and someone will pay," all in a single breath. And Elara, still seated on the staircase landing with a bruised shoulder and torn seam and their son kicking inside her as if he, too, was angry, looked into her husband's dark eyes and said, "I'm fine." 2 words. Reflex. Older than this marriage, older than Chicago, older than the Greyhound bus and $40, older all the way back to Mrs. Prentiss's house, where 14-year-old Elara learned that the safest way to survive was to make herself small, to make herself fine, to make herself not a burden, to say "I'm fine" before anyone even asked, so no one would have to worry, so no one would have reason to grow angrier, so the hand gripping her wrist too tight might loosen if she was small enough, fine enough, invisible enough. That reflex lived in her bones, in her muscles, in the neural pathways programmed at 14 that her pain didn't deserve to take up space. But this time, halfway through the words, Elara stopped. She heard her own voice, and she hated it, hated the reflex to shrink, hated the way she automatically minimized her own pain to make others comfortable, hated Mrs. Prentiss for installing it in her like a virus, hated every room, every hallway, every house that had taught her "I'm fine" was the only safe sentence. She looked at Jude, looked into the dark eyes holding her face with the gentlest hands she had ever known, and she corrected herself. "I'm fine. We're fine. But I'm angry, Jude. I need you to know that I'm angry." Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and steady, and carried the weight of a woman refusing for the first time in her life to shrink, refusing to turn her pain into something smaller than its true shape, refusing to say "I'm fine" when fine wasn't the point. Because she didn't need to be fine. Because the man kneeling in front of her had once told her she deserved a choice. And she was choosing anger, choosing to acknowledge that what had just happened on that staircase deserved anger, choosing to take up space. Something moved in Jude's eyes. Small, fast, controlled immediately, but she caught it. She always caught it. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't disappointment. It was something closer to recognition. Closer to the way he had looked at her through the kitchen doorway that night when she set down the knife and made Boone retreat. He looked at her like a man who knew he had chosen correctly. Then, and only then, Jude Moretti stood. He released her face gently, his fingers brushing her cheek one last time like marking a page, like saying, "I'll return to this." He straightened, adjusted his cuff with the automatic motion of a man stepping back into the version of himself the world knew, and he turned. For the first time since crossing the threshold, Jude Moretti looked at Collin Ashworth. He looked at him the way one studies a document before signing it, the way one reviews a line in a ledger before striking it out permanently, with the flat administrative certainty of someone who had made the decision long ago and was now merely completing procedure. Collin, still at the top of the staircase, motionless, not from courage but from paralysis. Every instinct in his body, screaming, conflicting instructions, and none of them winning, opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to deny, perhaps simply because he was accustomed to speaking without being told to stop. Don't. One word. Jude spoke a single word, barely louder than a whisper, and Collin's mouth closed, not because he wanted it to, but because his body understood, faster than his brain, that in this room, from the moment that door opened, he no longer had the right to make a sound. Outside, through the windows, 3 more vehicles pulled silently into the driveway. Headlights off, engines cut, doors opening and closing, with the precision of men who had done this many times before. Collin glanced toward the glass and understood for the first time that he wasn't standing inside his own house. He was standing on someone else's territory, and that someone had come to collect. Dr. Marin Holt arrived in 4 minutes. Jude had called before stepping into the mansion, a single message sent from the car, and Dr. Holt, the small, serious woman who had served the Moretti family for more than 12 years and understood that in this world urgency isn't a suggestion, drove through winter Chicago at a speed she would never acknowledge to any law enforcement agency. She stepped through the doors of the Ashworth mansion with her brown leather case and the expression of someone who had seen enough in her career never to waste time on emotion before completing the task. She knelt beside Elara, facing Jude, and began her examination with brisk precision, the efficiency of someone who understood that in this house excellence and silence are the 2 most highly compensated qualities. Jude didn't leave Elara's side. He sat on the cold marble floor. The man who commanded an underground financial empire and silenced boardrooms with a glance, sitting on a dirty floor in a suit more expensive than the car most people would drive in a lifetime, holding his wife's hand in both of his while the doctor worked. His thumb moved slowly across the back of her hand, steady, patient, their private language, a promise without words. The small fetal monitor was placed against Elara's belly, and the sound filled the foyer immediately, a strong, steady, stubborn rhythm, almost indignant, as if the baby were announcing his presence with considerable confidence that he belonged here, and no one had the right to think otherwise. Elara let out a small laugh, slightly broken but real, and Jude tightened his grip just enough for her to know he had heard, just enough for her to know he was still there. "Heartbeat is strong," Dr. Holt said in a professional tone, her eyes moving quickly over the readings. "Bruised shoulder, no fracture. She needs rest, monitoring, and no additional stress." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Collin, still frozen at the top of the stairs, then returned to her patient with perfect professionalism. "She's lucky. Lucky." Jude absorbed the word in silence. He didn't nod, didn't respond. He simply absorbed it, in the way Elara had learned to recognize over 9 months of marriage, the way he received information he intended to return at a later time with significant interest. His face didn't change, not a muscle moved, but Elara felt, through his hand holding hers, a subtle shift in pressure, like steel wire drawn 0.5 millimeter closer to its breaking point. His thumb continued its slow circle, steady, but the rhythm was slightly slower, slightly heavier. Then Jude stood. He released her hand gently, settled it on the blanket someone had draped over her at some unnoticed moment, and rose with the automatic precision of a man stepping back into his operational self. He adjusted his cuff, smoothed his jacket, then turned toward the 2 quiet professionals by the door, the men who had stood motionless since entering, and gave an order in a low, even voice, the kind of voice anyone passing by might mistake for a discussion about an afternoon schedule. "Take him to the warehouse on Pulaski. I'll be there in 1 hour." Elara didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. She had lived 9 months inside Jude Moretti's world. She knew the warehouse on Pulaski wasn't for storage. She knew 1 hour wasn't an appointment. She knew the distance between the man who had knelt and lifted her face with the gentlest hands she had ever known, and the man who had just issued that calm instruction was as thin as a strand of hair, and that strand had just snapped. The 2 men near the door began moving toward the staircase. Collin, at the top, watched them ascend, and for the first time, something appeared on his face beyond paralysis, something resembling real fear, the pure animal fear of prey that understands it has been cornered. And Elara spoke. "Jude." She said his name, not loudly, not pleading, not trembling, in a calm, steady voice, the voice of the only person in that room, in that building, in the entire city of Chicago, who had the right to speak that name and be heard. Jude stopped, The two men stopped. Everything in the room stopped, as if even the air were waiting. He turned back to her. And Elara, still seated on the floor, still cradling her 7-month belly, still wearing the torn uniform, looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man she had ever known, and said in a voice that accepted no answer but truth, "I need the man who comes home tonight to be the same man who knelt on this floor 5 minutes ago. Do you understand?" Silence followed, the kind that makes an entire room hold its breath. The two men on the stairs froze mid-step. Collin forgot even to be afraid. Dr. Holt's hands stilled, and Jude Moretti stood there, looking at his wife, and she saw the battle begin behind his eyes. The battle lasted only a few seconds, just a few, but Elara saw all of it, because she had spent 9 months learning how to read this man, learning to see what he concealed behind perfect control. And she knew that behind those dark eyes, in this moment, 2 versions of Jude Moretti stood facing each other in a room no one else was permitted to enter. On one side was the man who had built an empire with methodical ruthlessness, the man whose name Chicago whispered with reverence, the man who had learned from his father and his grandfather that when someone touches what belongs to you, you don't just take it back, you remove their ability to ever touch anything again. That version wanted the warehouse on Pulaski, wanted 1 hour inside a windowless room with Collin Ashworth and the absolute silence of thick concrete walls, wanted to turn the man who had shoved his pregnant wife down a staircase into a lesson no one in this city would dare forget. On the other side was the husband, the man who had knelt on marble 5 minutes earlier and lifted her face with the gentlest hands in the world, the man who had promised, not with words but with a platinum ring and a silent ceremony in his study, that he would be a safe place, that she would never have to fear his hands, that the world would burn before he allowed it to touch her, but that he himself wouldn't become something she needed to fear. Those 2 versions regarded each other, and Elara held his gaze. She didn't look away, didn't lower her eyes, didn't shrink. She looked directly into the war unfolding behind her husband's eyes with steady calm. No pleading, no fear, no judgment. Simply there, present, like someone holding the final thread, tethering him to the best version of himself, and refusing to let go. She had lived her entire life under the power of men. The power of her father when he left. The power of the foster system when it placed her in Mrs. Prentiss's house. The power of employers who paid her $4 an hour and called it a favor. The power of Collin Ashworth when he shoved her. But the power she was using now, the power keeping a man like Jude Moretti still in the middle of his own storm, wasn't given, borrowed, or permitted. It was hers. It had always been hers. It was the power she earned by surviving, by not dying on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, by picking up the knife before looking for the exit, by saying I'm angry instead of I'm fine, and by now, sitting on the floor with a bruised shoulder and torn uniform, looking into the eyes of the most powerful man she knew and telling him who she needed him to be. Jude looked at her. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Each second a front line in a war no one but the 2 of them knew was happening. Then something shifted. Not on his face. His face remained the flawless mask he had built over a lifetime, but somewhere deeper, where Elara was the only one who could see. His jaw loosened a millimeter no one else would notice. His shoulders lowered a fraction only she could measure, and he nodded. Small, nearly imperceptible, but she saw. He turned to the 2 men frozen mid-step on the staircase and gave another nod. A different nod, a different meaning. They stopped, stepped back, turned and descended to their posts near the door, with the silence of men who didn't require explanation to understand the order had changed. Collin Ashworth, rigid at the top of the stairs, his complexion drained from white to gray, didn't know he had just been spared his life. Didn't know the warehouse on Pulaski and an hour with Jude Moretti had been 1 sentence away, spoken by a pregnant woman sitting below him. Didn't know that for the 2nd time that day he had escaped death, and this time not because of Jude Moretti but because of Elara Whitfield, the woman he had called a maid, a shadow, disposable. But Jude knew, and Elara knew, and that was enough. Jude stood still for a moment, spine straight, face placid, and she watched him pivot to another strategy. Not surrender. Jude Moretti never surrenders. A redirection, from fast to slow, from violence to paperwork, from the warehouse on Pulaski to something cleaner, longer, and in a way only the informed would understand. Far more cruel. Because violence ends. Wounds close. Bones mend. But when a man like Jude Moretti decides to destroy you with documents, with law, with numbers and clauses and contracts, that destruction doesn't end. It follows you. It lives in every frozen account, every locked door, every unanswered call. It's the kind of ruin you wake up to each morning and find still there, intact, patient, permanent. Jude turned to Collin, and for the first time, he spoke to him. Not conversed, spoke. In the calmest voice Elara had ever heard from him, calmer even than when he ordered the warehouse on Pulaski. Calm in the way she had learned meant the decision was absolute, and what followed wasn't a threat, but fact. You have a passport. Not a question. Collin blinked. What? A passport. Jude clasped his hands behind his back, the posture of a man delivering a presentation rather than a threat, and somehow that was more terrifying than any raised fist. You have one. I'm asking if you know where it is, because the next 10 minutes will determine whether you'll ever need to use it again. He let the words settle, sink into the air, sink into Collin, whose last scraps of arrogance extinguished like a candle in a cold room. 10 minutes, Jude repeated softly. I'd use them wisely if I were you. The private clinic occupied the top floor of a Gold Coast building, whose lobby directory listed it as a consulting firm, one of 17 legitimate businesses the Moretti family used to keep important matters where no one looked too closely. The staff here didn't ask unnecessary questions. They understood their patients required two things above all else: excellence and silence. Elara was brought into an observation room within 20 minutes of leaving the Ashworth mansion. The room didn't resemble a hospital. The lighting was warm, the sheets cream-colored, the wide window overlooking Lake Michigan shimmering in the January night like a vast black mirror scattered with the city's lights. Someone had placed a white orchid on the table beside the bed. Elara suspected Jude had arranged it without comment, the way he arranged most important things. The fetal monitor was connected, and the steady rhythm filled the room immediately. Strong, even, stubborn. A sound she had heard hundreds of times over the past months, but tonight it carried a different weight. It was proof, a reminder. The voice of their son announcing to both of them that he was still here and he wasn't going anywhere. Night settled in. The clinic grew quiet except for the heartbeat and the faint hum of the heater. Dr. Holt completed her evening examination, confirmed once more that everything was stable, then departed with instructions for rest and a brief look toward Jude that conveyed, "I trust you'll ensure that." Elara lay back against the pillows, blanket drawn to her chest, her left hand resting on her belly, the band catching the dim glow of the bedside lamp. She couldn't sleep. Not because of pain, though her shoulder still throbbed. Not because of fear, though the staircase flashed behind her eyes whenever she closed them. But because of a question that had lived inside her since the first night in the black Escalade, since the scent of leather and the silence that demanded nothing, since the moment she looked into Jude Moretti's dark eyes on the Michigan Avenue Bridge and saw something she couldn't name until now. Recognition. Not recognition of her. Recognition of the moment. As if he had stood where she stood before, or had watched someone stand there, and this time, he refused to let the ending be the same. Jude sat in the chair beside her bed, where he had been since they arrived, one hand holding hers, the other resting on his thigh, his gaze fixed on the window or on nothing at all. She couldn't tell. He hadn't slept. She knew he wouldn't. Darkness surrounded them, broken only by the soft bedside lamp and the faint blue light from the monitor screen. And in that darkness, in the intimacy only darkness allows, Elara asked, "Why did you stop the car that night?" Her voice was quiet, not from weakness, because important questions don't need to be loud. On the bridge, the real reason. Jude didn't answer. Silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he had fallen asleep, or was pretending to sleep, or deciding this question belonged behind doors he kept permanently locked. The fetal heartbeat continued its steady rhythm in the room. 1 minute. 2. Then Jude spoke, in a level voice, so level that if you didn't know him, you'd think he was reading a news article or recounting someone else's story. But Elara knew. She had spent 9 months learning the language of this man, and she understood that the flatter Jude Moretti's voice became, the more what he was saying was tearing him apart from the inside. "Sarah," he said, "just a name, then silence, then more. My sister, 15 years younger than me. My mother had her when she was nearly 40 and called her a miracle. She was. Black hair, big eyes, when she laughed, The whole room turned to look. He paused. His thumb circled the back of Elara's hand, slower than usual. She was 19. Had a boyfriend. I didn't like him, but Sarah was headstrong and didn't listen to anyone. His voice remained unwavering, as calm as the surface of Lake Michigan beyond the window, level like something pressed flat for so long it no longer remembered its original shape. He hit her. I found out later. Didn't know at the time. Or maybe I did know, but I was in Detroit handling family business, doing what I always did, putting the empire before everything else because that's what my father taught and my grandfather taught and I didn't know another way. He inhaled, exhaled. Slowly. Sarah called me 3 times in the final week. I saw the missed calls. I thought I'd call back when I got home. Always when I get home. Always later. Always something else more important than your little sister calling 3 times in 1 week and not leaving a message. He didn't look at Elara. He looked into the darkness ahead, at something only he could see. And his voice stayed flat. So flat it became almost the most frightening sound she had ever heard, because she understood that the flatness was the only thing keeping him from breaking. I didn't make it home in time. 4 words. Jude spoke 4 words, and each one fell into the room like a stone dropped into a deep well, falling and falling until it struck bottom. And the echo didn't stop. I didn't make it home in time. Then silence. The fetal heartbeat continued its steady rhythm on the monitor, their son still telling his own story through that stubborn pulse, and Elara lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of her child living, and listening to her husband speak of someone who hadn't. Jude didn't look at her. He stared ahead, into the dark, toward the window, toward Lake Michigan, or toward 15 years ago, or toward the room where he had found his sister. She didn't know, and she didn't ask, because there are things you don't interrogate. You simply remain present, and let the one speaking choose how much to give. He continued. Brief, without drama, not because the story didn't hurt, but because he had carried it long enough to compress it into something hard and small and palm-sized, something he kept in the deepest part of his chest, and never removed for anyone to see until tonight. I never drive on Michigan Avenue. Never. 15 years in this city, and I never take that road. But that night something made me turn. I can't explain it. There was no logical reason. I just turned, and I saw you standing there. He paused, and when he went on, his voice was still steady, but Elara heard what lay beneath that composed surface, something like a hairline crack across a concrete dam, tiny, nearly invisible, but if you know it's there, you understand the pressure behind it. And I saw her. Sarah. He had seen Sarah in Elara. Seen his 19-year-old sister and the 26-year-old woman standing on a bridge in January rain. Seen the same edge, the same exhaustion. The same moment when the body stops moving forward, not because it has decided, but because it has run out of anything left to continue with. And this time he stopped the car. This time he didn't think when I get home. Didn't think later. Didn't place anything ahead of the person standing at the edge. This time he stopped. Elara didn't speak. No words were enough. She had lived 27 years inside language, used it to survive, to respond, to defend herself. Had said I'm angry when her entire life trained her to say I'm fine. But in this moment, in the darkness of a private clinic high above Lake Michigan, with her son's heartbeat steady as a soundtrack beneath the most painful story her husband had ever told, language wasn't sufficient. There was no sentence that could reach 15 years of a man punishing himself for not picking up the phone. So she didn't speak. She did what language couldn't do. She took his hand, the large hand that had held hers all night, and placed it on her belly. Gently, precisely. She set his palm where Asher was kicking, turning, living with the stubborn fury of a life that didn't yet know the world but had already decided it belonged in it. Jude felt the kick beneath his palm. His fingers flinched slightly. Instinctively, the reflex of a man who had just touched something so real, it pierced through every layer of control he had built. Then another kick, stronger, as if Asher knew his father's hand was there and was answering. Elara kept his hand against her, not comfort. She wasn't comforting him. Comfort was too small for this moment. This was evidence. Living evidence, kicking, turning, defiant, proof that this time he had taken the right road. This time he had stopped the car. This time he hadn't said when I get home. This time he hadn't arrived too late. Jude lowered his head, slowly, as if 15 years of gravity had finally won. His forehead rested against the back of her hand, where his palm still covered her belly, where their son was moving, and he stayed there, silent, He didn't cry. Jude Moretti doesn't cry. Not tonight. Not like this. He had built too many walls to allow that. But his forehead rested against her hand, with the weight of a man who had finally allowed himself to set something down that he had carried too long. And Elara felt that weight, felt it through skin and bone, and through the rhythm of her son's heartbeat beating between his palm and her body. And she lifted her free hand and placed it at the back of his neck, gently, holding him there, saying through touch rather than words that he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. When he lifted his head, she didn't count how long it had been. His eyes were dry, but something had shifted. Not entirely. What he carried wasn't the kind of burden you lay down once, but enough. Enough that the crack in the dam wouldn't widen tonight. Enough that when he looked at her, she saw not only the husband, not only the empire builder, but the man, whole with his wounds, whole with his loss, whole with 15 years of saying, "When I get home," and one rain-soaked night, finally saying, "Now." He didn't speak again. She didn't ask anything more. He climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, mindful of her bruised shoulder, and lay on his side, one hand still resting on her belly, feeling their son's movements. They lay in the darkness, listening to Asher's heartbeat fill the room like a conversation no one needed translated, and no one said anything else. No one needed to. Outside the window, Lake Michigan shimmered in the January night, and somewhere in the city, on the stretch of Michigan Avenue, Jude Moretti never drove. The rain had long since stopped. Sully Tran arrived at 6 in the morning. He was the kind of man you'd mistake for a high school teacher or a librarian if you passed him on the street. The gray cardigan he wore every day worn thin at the elbows, round-framed glasses, the quiet gait of someone who had spent a lifetime making himself unremarkable. But Sully Tran had been the chief financial investigator for the Moretti family for 15 years. And in those 15 years, he had never raised his voice, never arrived late, and never delivered an incomplete file. He stepped into the clinic, placed a manila envelope on the table beside Jude's untouched cup of coffee, nodded once, and left without being told. Jude hadn't slept. He had lain beside Elara until her breathing deepened and evened out, until her hand relaxed against her belly, and her sleeping face carried a peace he rarely saw when she was awake. Then he had risen quietly, taken the chair by the window again, and spent the remaining hours of the night, letting his mind move through calculations, with the slow, meticulous patience of a man who understands that the most permanent destruction is never carried out in haste. He opened the envelope. 47 pages. He read without expression, turning each page at the same measured pace, not lingering on anyone longer than another, not frowning, not tightening his jaw, his face flat as Lake Michigan outside the window on a windless winter morning. The story the documents told didn't surprise him. It was precisely what he had suspected from the moment the name Collin Ashworth first surfaced in connection with the mansion 18 months earlier. But suspicion and proof are two entirely different instruments, and what Sully had assembled wasn't suspicion. It was a complete ledger. In 2003, Richard Ashworth, Collin's father, had approached the Moretti organization for an emergency loan when his real estate portfolio collapsed. The terms were documented clearly, witnessed, and signed by Richard's own hand. A large sum, structured interest, and the collateral, listed in precise legal language on page 11, was the entire Ashworth estate. Richard Ashworth never repaid a single dollar. Not 1 month, not one installment. He died in 2019, leaving his son not an inheritance but a debt so large it had compounded for 16 years. And Collin inherited the mansion, believing it belonged to him, because Richard, in the particular cowardice of men who create disasters they lack the courage to face, had never told his son the truth. Collin Ashworth had been living inside a debt he didn't know existed, inside a house that had been under the legal claim of the Moretti family longer than he had owned anything in his life. Jude set the file down. He looked toward Elara, still asleep, her right hand resting over her belly, with the unconscious protectiveness that had become her natural posture in recent months, and the pale January morning light filtering through the clinic window, found the platinum ring on her finger and held it there, making it glint like a small signal in the gray dawn. He thought about the staircase, about her hand striking marble, about the torn seam at her shoulder, about the way she had wrapped her arms around her belly before herself, a mother's instinct stronger than self-preservation. He thought about a man who had looked at his wife, his pregnant wife, a woman who had survived West Virginia and foster care, and every indifferent cold space this world had offered her, and seen something disposable, Something moved behind Jude's eyes. Not anger. Anger had passed the night before, had been pulled back from the edge of the warehouse on Pulaski by Elara's voice, had been compressed and transformed into something colder and more patient and far more effective. What moved there now was certainty, the quiet, administrative certainty of a man who has opened a file and is now going to close it. He stepped into the hallway, where the two men stationed outside Elara's door straightened at the subtle shift in his presence. He made 3 calls in 11 minutes. His voice never rose above conversational tone. Anyone walking past would assume he was discussing quarterly returns or a property transaction. The first call was to Sully. Prepare the full legal repossession filing. I want it ready to submit before noon. The second was to a journalist, a principled woman who had exposed 3 major corruption cases in 4 years and owed the Moretti family nothing except a single favor she had held in reserve since 2021. Jude told her to review the ownership records of the Ashworth estate, told her what she would find, told her she had 48 hours before it became relevant. The third call was the quietest, a single sentence to a man whose name appeared on no organizational chart, but whose responsibilities were substantial. Find everything Collin Ashworth ever needed to hide. He ended the call, stood in the hallway for a moment, phone still in his hand, eyes focused on something only he could see. Then he adjusted his jacket, opened the door, and returned to the room with his wife and the steady rhythm of his son's heartbeat. Collin Ashworth hadn't stolen from a maid. He had stolen from the Moretti family, and the Moretti family, unlike the world Collin had always relied on to look away, kept exceptionally precise records. Collin Ashworth discovered the true scale of his situation on Thursday morning, while ordering his usual breakfast at the cafe 3 blocks from the mansion, the cafe he had visited every morning for 5 years, where the staff knew his name and how he liked his eggs, and which newspaper he preferred. He handed over his card. Declined. He laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they assume the machine is wrong, not them, and withdrew a second card, the one he reserved for special occasions, the card with a limit he had once mentioned to friends after dinner, as proof of his position in the world. Declined. He pulled out a third. Declined. He sat at the corner table with a frozen smile on his face, the smile of a man whose exterior was running about 4 seconds ahead of the collapse happening inside, offered a polite apology, stood, and walked straight to his car, where he gripped the steering wheel with both hands and tried to remember how breathing worked. His phone displayed 14 missed calls. The automated banking system informed him, in a pleasant neutral tone reserved exclusively for catastrophic news, that his accounts had been frozen under a legal repossession procedure initiated by Moretti Holdings International, a reference number 40 digits long, an amount listed as a figure his brain couldn't comfortably process on an empty stomach, a number with so many zeros it stopped resembling money and began to resemble a sentence, and in a sense, that's exactly what it was. He called his first attorney. Voicemail, a cheerful professional greeting, the voice of someone who was elsewhere or choosing to be elsewhere, and the difference between those two possibilities suddenly felt brutally clear. He called his accountant. A stranger answered, a female voice he had never heard, informing him in polite mechanical cadence that the firm was unable to discuss his accounts at this time. No explanation, no appointment. Just at this time, 2 words that closed doors more softly than any slam and more permanently. He called his closest friend from college, the man who had attended his birthday dinners 15 years in a row, borrowed money from him twice without mentioning repayment, called him brother in every social media post, and raised a glass with him every New Year's Eve. The call connected. 3 seconds of silence after Collin said his name. 3 seconds. Short enough to pretend it was signal delay. Long enough for both of them to know it wasn't. Then a careful apology. Something about an upcoming family vacation and poor reception, and perhaps they could talk next week. The call ended. Collin sat in his car outside the cafe, still in the suit he had put on early that morning, because he was the kind of man who wore a suit to eat breakfast alone. Because the suit reminded him who he was, or reminded him who he believed himself to be, and he understood. Not all at once, not like flipping a switch, but with the slow, horrifying clarity of someone watching a building collapse floor by floor. The top level first, then the next, each one dragging the one below with the accumulated weight of everything it once held. And you stand there watching, and you know the foundation will be the last thing left. And when the foundation gives way, there will be nothing left to stand on. The architecture of his life had never belonged to him. The mansion wasn't his. The property had been under a legal lien by the Moretti family since 2009, a ticking clock that Collin's father had hidden from him, while the unpaid debt slowly consumed the estate's entire value. The money wasn't his. It was credit built on collateral he didn't own, a paper house built on paper ground. And now someone had pulled the sheet from the bottom, and everything was falling with the velocity of gravity and truth. His friends weren't his. They belonged to the mansion, to the dinners and the wine and the credit limits. And when those vanished, they vanished with them, quickly and without apology, like water withdrawing from shore before a tidal wave arrives. He sat there in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the familiar street he had driven every morning for 5 years, a street unchanged from yesterday, and yet somehow no longer his. And he thought about the woman on the staircase landing, thought about the torn uniform, thought about the way she had wrapped her arms around her belly, thought about her voice when she said, "Your time just ran out," and the way he had laughed, truly laughed, because he had believed she was a maid, a shadow, nothing at all. And now sitting there with 3 declined credit cards and a phone no one answered, he began to understand she wasn't the shadow. He was. He had always been the shadow of his father, the shadow of a debt his father created, the shadow of a life his father constructed with someone else's money and then died, leaving him to live inside it like a haunted house, without realizing the ghost was himself. The Ashworth mansion was officially repossessed by Moretti Holdings International at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The legal filing, submitted that very morning, had been prepared with such meticulous precision that the attorney Collin hastily retained, the third lawyer he managed to reach after the first 2, declined the case without explanation, sat in silence for 40 minutes reading before advising his client, in the careful language of someone delivering a final diagnosis, that there were no viable grounds for appeal. The debt was real. The collateral agreement was legally unassailable. 16 years of compounded interest had, if anything, been calculated conservatively. Every period, every comma, every seal was in place, as if the person who assembled the file had spent a lifetime waiting for precisely this moment and intended that when it arrived, it would be flawless. A journalist photographed Collin outside the mansion at 4 in the afternoon. He carried 2 bags through the front door he had always used as an entrance, and was now using for the last time as an exit. The article was online within an hour. By evening, it had spread widely, not because anyone in particular cared about Collin Ashworth, but because the story contained one detail the journalist had positioned carefully in the 4th paragraph, a detail that made readers pause and read again. The debt that cost him everything had been accruing since before he graduated college. He had spent borrowed favor throughout his entire adult life without ever knowing it. The story circulated because it touched a private fear most people carry and rarely confess, the fear that the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they assume, that what they call mine was never truly theirs. Collin's fiancée didn't call. Her assistant called at 6 in the evening to arrange for the retrieval of personal belongings from the estate. The assistant, not her. That distinction was small but contained the entire nature of the relationship, that it existed within the same space as the mansion, and when the mansion disappeared, it vanished with it. No explanation, no conversation, only an assistant and a list of items. Collin spent his first night at a hotel on the west side of Chicago, only a few miles on a map from Gold Coast and everything he had known, but an ocean away in practice. The hotel accepted the one credit card not yet processed in the legal action, a modest place, with hallways that smelled faintly of instant noodles and windows overlooking a parking lot. He sat on the edge of the bed, in his navy suit and gold cufflinks, the 2 remnants of his former life still on his body like a knight's armor after the final defeat, and stared at the wall. Across the city, in the private clinic high above Lake Michigan, Elara read the article on her phone. Jude was in the adjoining room speaking with Sully about next steps, and she lay alone under the dim bedside lamp, scrolling through each line, reading the account of Collin Ashworth's collapse, and she didn't feel triumph. She had expected it, thought it would come, that when the man who had shoved her down the stairs lost everything, she would feel something like justice, like balance, like the world correcting itself. But it didn't come. Instead, something more complicated surfaced, something that required a few quiet minutes in the dark for her to recognize and name. She remembered Mrs. Prentiss, remembered the hand gripping her wrist too tightly, remembered the hiss in the dark hallway. "You ought to be grateful someone even took you in." Remembered the morning she was 17 when she carried her bag out of that house, and no one called her back. No one asked where she was going. No one noticed she had gone, and her absence was absorbed into the air, as though she had never occupied space there at all. She remembered that feeling, the feeling of the world turning its back all at once, the feeling of lifting a phone and having no one to call, the feeling of discovering the space you occupy in other people's lives is smaller than you believed. So small it closes behind you without leaving a mark. And she looked at the article, at the photograph of Collin carrying 2 bags through the front door, and she saw in him something she didn't want to see, something she hated recognizing, because she didn't want to look at the man who had pushed her down the stairs and find herself. But she did. She saw another version of invisibility, not the kind she had lived, the invisibility of someone the world decided didn't matter from the beginning, but the kind that happens when everything you believe defines you is stripped away, and you discover that underneath it all, you don't know who you are without those things. That kind of invisibility, in some ways, is more terrifying, because at least Elara had always known who she was when she had nothing. She set the phone down, rested her hand on her belly. Asher kicked softly beneath her palm, steady and familiar and peaceful. And in the darkness of the clinic room, with her son's heartbeat and the article still glowing on the screen, a seed began to form. Not yet a decision, not yet a plan, just a question, small and quiet, unanswered but certain to demand an answer eventually. When you know what it feels like to be invisible, do you allow yourself to make someone else invisible? Even if that someone is the person who pushed you down? Elara found him on a Tuesday. She wasn't looking for him. She was on her way back from a meeting with the legal team of the Whitfield Foundation on the West Side, the first in a series of meetings she had begun arranging, after the seed planted in the darkness of that clinic room had taken root, had grown into something with shape, with intention, with a name. She was in her 8th month, and moved with the careful awareness of a woman who had accepted that her body now operated on its own timetable, and she had told the driver to take the longer route home because she liked watching the city through the window, liked observing the ordinary rhythm of it, people heading to work, children spilling out of school, storefronts opening and closing, the plain honesty of a life where no one was trying to kill anyone else. The car slowed along a street on the west side, only a few miles from Gold Coast, but belonging to a different Chicago, a Chicago of convenience stores with iron bars on the windows and concrete benches along the sidewalk, where people sat because there was nowhere else to sit, and she almost didn't recognize him. Collin Ashworth sat on a bench outside a convenience store in a suit she remembered costing more than her monthly salary once upon a time. But the suit hadn't been pressed in days. The shoulders creased, the collar collapsed, like clothes left hanging on a mannequin long after the display season ended. The gold cufflinks were gone. He was eating something from a plastic container with mechanical motions, lifting the spoon to his mouth and lowering it, and lifting it again, with the detachment of someone who had forgotten that food was supposed to mean anything beyond keeping the body functioning. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was still the same height, the same broad shoulders, the same face that had once looked down at her from the top of the stairs with absolute contempt. But something structural had been removed from him, the way a building looks different once the internal frame has been taken out, still standing, but no longer solid. Elara told the driver to stop. The car pulled to the curb 20 steps from the bench. She sat inside, one hand resting on her belly, Asher kicking lightly within her as though he, too, was waiting to see what his mother would decide. And she thought about the version of herself who had stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge in the January rain and felt invisible. Thought about every hallway she had walked through with her head lowered, every room where she had made herself smaller to occupy the least possible space. Every time she had absorbed someone else's cruelty because survival required it. She thought about Mrs. Prentiss, the hand gripping her wrist, the whisper in the dark, "You should be grateful," the 14-year-old girl trembling in a hallway, and the 17-year-old girl who stopped trembling, boarded a Greyhound bus with $40, and didn't look back. She thought about Sarah, the 19-year-old girl Jude hadn't reached in time, the girl Jude had seen in Elara on the bridge in the rain. The girl whose absence had carved a wound so deep that 15 years later it was still the first thing he saw when someone stood at the edge. And she thought about circles, violence and invisibility. Collin's father borrowed money and created a debt. The debt swallowed the sun. The sun shoved her down the stairs. She could shove back. She could let Jude destroy him not only financially but completely. She could sit in the car and watch him eat from a plastic container on a sidewalk bench and feel justice. And the circle would continue. Violence breeding violence, invisibility breeding invisibility, forever. Or she could step out. She looked at Collin through the glass, and she saw what she had seen in that article in the clinic, the thing she hated recognizing. The expression on his face as he stared into the plastic container was the same expression she had once seen in the mirror of a public restroom at the Greyhound station 10 years earlier. The same emptiness, the same disorientation, the same look of someone who had lost everything they used to define themselves and discovered that underneath there was nothing at all. She didn't want to see herself in him. She didn't want to feel anything for the man who had placed his hand on her shoulder and pushed, who had watched her fall with 7 months of life inside her and then adjusted his cuff. She wanted the clean simplicity of anger, the kind she had earned the right to feel. But Elara Whitfield had never been someone who chose what was easy. She had survived not by choosing the easy road, but by choosing the one she could live with when she looked back. And she knew, sitting in that car with her hand on her belly and her son kicking beneath her palm, that if she drove away she would survive, but if she stepped out she would build, and she was done merely surviving. The circle ends here. She opened the car door and stepped out into the March afternoon on Chicago's west side, into the pale sunlight the city had worked hard to earn after a long winter, and walked toward the bench. Collin saw her before she reached him. He was lifting the spoon to his mouth when his eyes caught the figure of a woman stepping out of the black car parked along the curb, moving slowly, one hand supporting her lower back, 8 months pregnant, brown hair falling over her shoulders, and he recognized her immediately. The spoon stopped midair. The plastic container on his lap was forgotten, and what appeared on Collin Ashworth's face wasn't arrogance, wasn't contempt, wasn't the cheap confidence of the man who had once stood at the top of the staircase adjusting his cuff after shoving a pregnant woman. What appeared was shame. Real. Unperformed. Not the kind arranged neatly on a face for others to witness and forgive. Not the kind packaged into apologies and remorseful smiles, but the kind that lives inside the body, the kind that makes shoulders fold inward, and eyes lose their place and hands suddenly feel unnecessary. The kind you can't switch off because it doesn't exist on the surface, but in bone, in muscle, in the way you draw breath. He began to stand, reflexively, out of habit. The instinct of a man raised to stand when a woman approaches. "Don't," Elara said softly. He sat back down. She walked to the bench and took the other end, leaving a deliberate space between them, and looked ahead at the street instead of at him. A group of children passed with their teacher, loud and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the weight of what was unfolding above their heads on that concrete bench. "Elara, I didn't come here to hear an apology," she said calmly, eyes still forward. "I've learned that apologies are for the people who speak them, not the people who hear them. I came because there's something more useful." She reached into her bag and took out a file, 4 pages, already prepared, already reviewed by 3 attorneys, each of whom had noted the considerable generosity of it given the circumstances. She placed it on the bench between them. "The Whitfield Foundation is establishing a support center for immigrant working women on the west side. We need the annex building adjacent to the mansion, the one your father built in 1998 and never used. Moretti Holdings has agreed to separate it from the repossession under one condition." She paused. For the first time, she turned to look at him. "You transfer it to the foundation. Voluntarily. Publicly. No legal contest. No further involvement from any party." She held his gaze with the blue-gray eyes he had once looked down into from the top of the stairs and seen a maid, a shadow. Nothing at all. "You're being given the chance to do one decent thing. That's what I'm offering you." Collin looked at the file without touching it. He stared at it as if it were written in a language he had never learned, something whose individual words he might recognize, but couldn't comprehend when placed side by side. Then he asked, and his voice came stripped of everything it once carried. No arrogance, no contempt, no cheap certainty, only the bare voice of a man standing in ruins, trying to understand why someone would hand him the first brick. "Why? After what I did?" Elara was silent. She considered the question honestly before answering, because she didn't offer empty replies, and she respected the weight of that question enough to give it a real answer. "Because I spent years waiting for the world to see me," she said at last. "I don't need you to see me anymore. I already know what I am." She stood carefully, one hand supporting her belly, and before turning away, she added, her voice lighter, Not softer, but lighter in the way of someone setting something heavy down and choosing not to carry it any farther. But I think you need to do something that matters before you forget that you still can. She left the file on the bench. She didn't look back. She walked toward the car, slow and steady, hand resting on her stomach, the pale March sunlight settling across her shoulders, and she walked with the posture of someone who had decided and didn't need to turn around to know the decision was right. Collin sat on the bench watching her leave, watched the black car door close, the engine start, the vehicle merge into traffic, watched until it disappeared around the corner and the street returned to itself. Children, horns, the smell of street food, life continuing without his permission. The file lay on the bench between the plastic food container and the empty space where she had just sat. He didn't touch it that day. 3 days later, the signed documents arrived by courier at the Foundation's legal office. No note, no explanation, no letter of apology, no justification, only a signature at the bottom of the final page, written in the careful hand of a man who was trying, perhaps for the first time in his life, to leave behind something that wasn't a debt. The first contraction came at 3 o'clock on Friday morning. Elara knew immediately, not from the pain, though the pain was considerable, and arrived with the unsparing efficiency of something that had waited patiently long enough, but from the quality of the silence beforehand, the kind of silence where the air changes density, the kind of silence that comes before important things, before the moments that split your life into before and after. She had learned to recognize it. She lay still for 60 seconds, counting, one hand on her belly feeling the contraction move through her like a wave, the other resting on Jude's warm, heavy arm draped across her waist. Then she said his name. He woke before she finished the second syllable. That was something she had noticed about her husband in the months they had lived together. He didn't move from sleep to wakefulness the way ordinary people do. Slowly, hazy, needing a few seconds to assemble the world again. He arrived at awareness already complete, as if some part of him never truly stopped keeping watch. He sat up and read her face in the dark with total focus before she could even finish her sentence. "It's time," she said simply. His hand was reaching for his phone before she finished speaking. The next 40 minutes unfolded with the fierce organization that marked everything Jude Moretti touched. The private clinic was notified in the first call. Dr. Marin Holt, who had been on standby for the past 2 weeks, answered on the first ring. The car was brought to the door in 4 minutes. Jude carried the bag Elara had packed 6 weeks earlier, then repacked twice, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had believed preparation was the most reliable form of prayer. In the car, Jude held her hand through each contraction. His thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand, steady, even, the familiar rhythm she had first felt on the marble floor of the Ashworth mansion, and hundreds of times since. Their private language, a promise without words. She focused on that rhythm when the pain arrived, clung to it like an anchor, and between contractions, when the world briefly stopped hurting and allowed her to breathe, she thought of her mother. She thought of Mama Jo in McDowell County, in somebody else's kitchen, her hands submerged in dishwater, her back bent with exhaustion, and yet her voice never tired, that voice always carrying something Elara had taken a long time to recognize as faith. "You're going to be great, baby girl." Mama Jo had said that while washing dishes in someone else's home, had said it with hands cracked from cheap soap and knees aching from scrubbing floors, had said it with the absolute certainty of someone who believed in something the world had never provided a shred of evidence for. And Elara, lying in a car cutting through Chicago at 4 a.m. with contraction pain, and her husband's hand and her son about to arrive, finally understood that her mother hadn't been speaking about the future. She had been speaking about essence, about what Elara already was, had always been, even when the world refused to look. She thought of every version of herself that hadn't survived to this moment, the version who had almost died in Mrs. Prentiss's house, the version who had slept in a storage shed in Humboldt Park, the version who had stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge and felt her legs stop moving, the version who had been shoved down a staircase with 7 months of life inside her. Each version, each one, could have been the ending. And none of them were the ending, because the version that survived, the version lying here now, hurting, breathing, holding her husband's hand, preparing to meet her son, that version was more stubborn than anything the world had thrown at her. Not because she was strong in the way people like to talk about strength, not because she didn't hurt or wasn't afraid or never wanted to quit, but because every time she wanted to quit, she heard Mama Jo's voice in that dishwater kitchen, and she chose to believe. The private clinic, Warm lights. Dr. Holt ready. Elara was brought into the delivery room, and from that moment everything narrowed to three things: pain, breath, and Jude. He didn't leave the room. Not once. He stood where she could see him, to the left of the bed, steady, present, like a pillar she could hold onto with her eyes while her body became a battlefield. Sometimes he tightened his grip when the pain peaked, his large hand enclosing her smaller one with strength. He controlled millimeter by millimeter, firm enough for her to know he was here, gentle enough not to add pain. Sometimes he said her name, Elara, in a low, even voice, a sound with no medical function Dr. Holt could chart, and yet absolutely necessary in the way only people who have loved someone through pain understand. Necessary, because sometimes in the middle of a storm, the only thing that keeps you anchored is someone saying your name and reminding you that you're still here, you're still you. You are not only this pain. The ninth hour. The pain arrived with a ferocity no language can adequately contain, because language is invented by people who aren't in pain, and those who are don't have time for language. Elara gripped Jude's hand and squeezed hard enough that she knew if he were another man he would have winced. But Jude didn't wince. He tightened his hold in return. Steady. Even. Her anchor in the storm her body had become, and she fixed her focus on the pressure of his hand as though it were the only real thing left, while the pain swallowed everything else. Then between contractions, in the brief mercy her body granted her, she spoke, through broken breath, through dry lips, through a voice worn raw by the passing hours. She said, "Tell me her name." Jude understood at once. No explanation, no context, because between them, in the private language built of circling thumbs and silence, and the sound of a fetal heartbeat in the dark, there was only one name that sentence could mean. "Sarah," he said. His sister's name left him softly, softer than she had ever heard him speak anything, soft in the way a person says the name of someone they have lost when that person feels very near. Elara nodded, her eyes closed. The next contraction was rising. She could feel it gathering deep within her, but before it crested, she spoke again, and her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone saying what she knows to be true, even if no one can prove it. "She's here too. She brought us here." Something shifted across Jude's face. Small, quick, controlled almost instantly by 15 years of practice, concealing every tenderness behind a wall. But Elara caught it. She always did. And what she saw in that fraction of a second before he rebuilt the mask was a crack, deep and real, the kind a beam of light can slip through. Because Elara had just done something no one had done for Jude Moretti in 15 years since Sarah was gone. She didn't erase the loss, didn't say everything would be all right, didn't try to mend it. She invited Sarah into the room, invited her into this moment where new life was arriving and said she belonged here, that the road from a 19-year-old girl to the baby about to be born wasn't straight, but it existed, and every step along it, even the most painful ones, had led to this hour. Labor continued. Dr. Holt worked with the focused precision of a physician who had delivered children into powerful families for 2 decades and prided herself on professional detachment. Yet later she would tell her assistant she had never seen a man with a reputation like Jude Moretti look at another human being the way he looked at his wife during those hours, as though she were the most important thing that had ever existed in any room he entered. Asher James Moretti was born at 2:17 in the afternoon. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He announced himself immediately, without hesitation, in a sound so pure and indignant and alive that Elara laughed and cried at the same time, a combination she hadn't known her body could produce until Dr. Holt laid her son on her chest. Asher had his mother's blue-gray eyes and his father's unshakable expression of absolute certainty about his own importance. He looked at Elara with the fierce focus of someone who had somewhere to be and had finally arrived. Something closed inside her ribcage, not filled, because she had never been empty. Closed, a circle sealed. A long and complicated journey reached a place she hadn't known she was heading toward until she stood in it. She looked up at Jude, and Jude Moretti, the man the city feared, the man whose name rearranged rooms and silenced conversations, the man who had dismantled Collin Ashworth's entire life, with 3 phone calls and 47 pages of legal filings, was crying. Not theatrically. Not the kind of crying smaller men use to display emotion. Simply, honestly. The way a human being cries when something larger than every wall he has ever built breaks open inside him, and the tears find their way out not because the walls collapse, but because what stands beyond them is too beautiful to contain. He touched his son's face with one finger. Lightly, carefully. His finger was nearly the size of Asher's entire hand, and the black platinum band on his ring finger caught the April afternoon light filtering through the delivery room window. Asher, he said. Only the name. 2 syllables. Yet within those 2 syllables were greeting and promise, and the entire future he would build and protect, and, if necessary, set the world on fire to keep safe. 15 years of saying when I get back finally becoming now. Sarah had brought him here. Elara had kept him here. The tiny boy on his wife's chest looked at him with blue-gray eyes, and the unshakable conviction that from this moment forward, everything would be different. Elara lifted her hand and took his. Her smaller hand folded into his, their matching bands catching the same slant of afternoon light. And she said the 2 words she had waited her whole life to speak in a place where they were finally true. We're home. And for the first time in a very long time, longer than either of them could precisely measure, it was entirely true. The Whitfield Center opened on a Saturday morning in April. It occupied 3 floors of the building on the west side that had once been the abandoned annex of a confiscated mansion, renovated so completely that only the skeleton of the original structure remained recognizable. The exterior was washed in warm terracotta and cream, colors Elara had chosen because she wanted the building to look like a place people would want to enter, not a place they were forced to seek out. There were no steps at the entrance, because Elara had specified throughout the design process that she didn't want any woman arriving exhausted and burdened to face one more obstacle before crossing the threshold. Inside were bright rooms and a kitchen that always carried the scent of something cooking. There were legal counselors and language tutors, and a childcare room painted the color of sunlight, where small shoes lined up neatly by the door. There was a medical clinic operating 3 days a week, and there was a quiet room at the end of the second-floor hallway, furnished with a single, comfortable chair and a window overlooking the small courtyard in back, where someone had planted roses. Elara had planted them the previous fall, 8 months pregnant. Kneeling in the soil while Jude stood behind her, pretending to supervise and handing her bulbs when she asked. The man who ran an underground financial empire standing in a garden holding a shovel, and never once suggesting that perhaps his 8-month pregnant wife shouldn't be kneeling in the dirt. He understood that this was something she needed to do with her own hands. On the door of the quiet room at the end of the hallway hung a small plaque. Elara had installed it without telling Jude beforehand. She brought it with her that morning in her bag and fastened it to the door herself, while the staff prepared the main room for the opening. The plaque bore 2 words, Sarah Room. Jude saw it as he walked down the hallway carrying Asher in his arms, 3 months old and sleeping with the absolute confidence of someone who had never known the world could be unsafe. He stopped, his eyes fixed on the plaque, and for a moment, brief, perhaps not even 2 seconds before he gathered himself, his face changed. It changed in the way Elara had seen only once before. In the delivery room when Asher was born, and every wall he had built over a lifetime hadn't been enough to contain his tears. He lifted one hand, the one not holding Asher, and placed it against the plaque. His palm pressed to the wood, to the 2 words, to his sister's name, in a place where it would remain permanently, not on a headstone, but on the door of a room where exhausted women would come to sit and breathe, and look out at a garden of roses, and know that somewhere in this world, a space had been built for them to rest. He kept his hand there for a second, then he lowered it, adjusted Asher against his chest, and walked on without speaking. He didn't need to speak. The opening wasn't a grand event. There were no celebrities, no reporters from major newspapers, only a small group of people who mattered, foundation staff. The first 12 women enrolled in the center's program. Dr. Holt, Sully Tran in his gray cardigan worn thin at the elbows, and Bria Okafor, the 24-year-old woman from Nigeria who had arrived in Chicago 3 months earlier with the wrong visa and the right determination, the first to step through the center's doors when it quietly opened 6 weeks before the official ceremony. Jude stood at the back of the room holding Asher, 3 months old and possessing very strong opinions about the ceremony, the boy having inherited his father's tendency toward focused observation and his mother's tendency toward high-volume emotional expression, currently demonstrating the latter in a way that made everyone nearby smile. Elara stood at the front. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a deep amber dress her old friend had sent from West Virginia when she heard about the opening, the sister she had spoken to more in the past 4 months than in the previous 4 years, because some distances collapse when circumstances finally allow. Her brown hair fell over her shoulders, The circle of platinum caught the morning light. She had no prepared speech. She had decided to abandon it at 4 a.m. 2 nights earlier, sitting in the nursing chair in the dark while Jude slept, and the city lay quiet, realizing that rehearsed words felt like performance, and these women deserved something more honest. She spoke for 7 minutes. She told them about rain in Chicago, about a cleaning company that took her wages and her documents, about standing on a bridge and feeling the particular exhaustion of someone the world has decided doesn't matter. She told them about a man who stopped his car not because she was important to him at the time, but because she was human, and that was reason enough. She said that greatness, in its most honest form, is simply the decision to turn your survival into a doorway for someone else. She said they weren't ghosts, they weren't disposable, that this building, these rooms, the garden of roses and the step-free door, all existed because their lives were worthy of that architecture. The room was very quiet when she finished. Then Bria, the young woman from Nigeria, seated in the 3rd row, began to clap. The sound started small, and then filled the room the way dawn fills a dark space. Not all at once, but thoroughly enough that you can't quite remember how dark it had been before. Elara looked to the back of the room. Jude was watching her, Asher against his chest, one large hand spanning their son's small back, his black eyes holding an expression she had learned to recognize in their months together, the expression that meant she had just done something that exceeded even his considerable vocabulary for admiration. He nodded once. She nodded back. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the Whitfield Center had returned to quiet, Elara and Jude sat in the small courtyard out back, where the roses she planted the previous fall were beginning to bloom in the April darkness. Asher slept in his stroller beside them, his breathing soft and even, the April air carrying that particular gentleness the city sometimes chooses, briefly, to offer. Elara leaned into Jude's shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. "Your mother was right," he said quietly. Elara smiled. She usually was. Above them, the Chicago sky deepened toward ink, and the first stars found their places with the unhurried confidence of things that have always known exactly where they belong. And that is the story of Elara Whitfield, the woman who came to Chicago with nothing but her dignity and left her mark on an entire city. The woman who was pushed down and chose to stand back up without carrying bitterness. The woman who was called invisible and built a building so that no one else would have to feel that way again. The woman who loved a dangerous man and made him gentle. The woman who carried a child through chaos and gave birth in peace. This story reminds us that true strength doesn't lie in striking back, but in choosing to build when you have every reason to destroy. That mercy isn't weakness, but the highest form of power. And that you don't need the world to see you to know your worth. You only need to see yourself. Now we'd like to hear from you. When Elara sat down on that bench beside the man who pushed her down the stairs and offered him a choice instead of punishment, do you think she was right? Was it mercy? Or was it power? Or are the two, in the end, the same thing? And the question we truly hope you carry with you tonight is this. In your own life, what are you merely surviving instead of building? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read and listen, because your story matters just as much as the one you've just heard. If this story touched you today, please click the like button so it can reach those who may need it. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that silence doesn't mean weakness. And subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story, because we tell stories every day, and each one is written to find you at the moment you need it most. You're not a ghost. You never were. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.